The sun was setting over the Texas prairie when Thomas Brennan first saw her hanging from that old cottonwood tree. He'd been riding the fence line like he did most evenings, and checking on the cattle that grazed near the western edge of his property, and thinking about supper and whether Martha would have made that cornbread he loved so much. At first he thought it was just a trick of the fading light, and maybe a torn piece of cloth caught in the branches, and the way the wind sometimes played, games with your eyes out here where the land stretched on forever. But then his horse copper nickered low in her throat, and that old mare had better instincts than most people Thomas knew, and he urged her forward, and his heart starting to beat, a little faster. As he got closer, he could see it was a woman and young from what he could tell, and her arms stretched up above her head and her wrists bound to a low branch, and her feet barely touching the ground. Her dress was torn and dirty and stained with what looked like blood near her stomach, and her head hung forward and her dark hair covering her face. And for a terrible moment Thomas thought he was too late. "Miss," he called out, and his voice rougher than he intended, and, "Miss Ken, you hear me?" She didn't move at first, and then slowly, and so slowly he almost missed it, and her head lifted just a fraction. Thomas dismounted faster than he had in years, and his knees protesting the movement and reminding him he wasn't the young ranch hand he used to be, and he was beside her in moments and pulling his knife from his belt. "I'm going to cut you down now," he said gently, "and I'm Thomas Brennan, and I own the land here, and you're safe now." He sliced through the ropes, and they were rough hemp and tied cruelly tight, and had cut into her wrist something fierce, and when she fell forward he caught her, and easier than he expected because she weighed almost nothing. Up close he could see she was maybe 25 or so, and with a face that would have been pretty if it wasn't so bruised and swollen, and her lip split, and her eye blackened, and whoever had done this to her had meant her real harm. "Water," she whispered, and her voice like dried leaves. Thomas carried her, to Copper and the horse standing patient as always, and he got his canteen and held it to her lips, and careful not to give her too much too fast. She drank, and then coughed, and then drank again, and her eyes, and they were brown, he noticed, and dark, brown like creek stones, and focusing on him properly for the first time. "Thank you," she managed. "Can you ride?" Thomas asked, "And my ranch house is about 2 miles east, and my wife Martha, she's got medical training, and she can tend to those wounds." The woman nodded, and though she winced with the movement, Thomas helped her onto Copper and then climbed up behind her and keeping one arm around her waist to hold her steady, and she was shaking, he realized, and trembling like a newborn foal. They rode, slowly, and Thomas not wanting to jostle her more than necessary, and the sun sinking lower and painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. "What's your name?" he asked after a while, and his voice quiet. "Elizabeth," she said. "And Elizabeth Hayes." "Well, Miss Hayes," Thomas said, "and you don't have to talk about what happened, and not until you're ready, but you're safe now, and I promise you that." He felt her relax slightly against him, and just a fraction. When they reached the ranch house, Martha was on the porch and shelling peas into a bowl, and when she saw them coming and Thomas holding someone in front of him, and she was on her feet immediately and the bowl forgotten. "Thomas," she called, and concern flooding her voice. "Found her tied to a tree out on the west section," Thomas said as he dismounted and then helped Elizabeth down, "and she's hurt pretty bad." Martha, and who had been a nurse during the war and all those years ago when they were both young, and took one look at Elizabeth and went into that calm and efficient mode Thomas had always admired. "Bring her inside," she said. "And right to the spare room, and Thomas, you'll need to heat water and lots of it, and bring my medical kit from the closet." Over the next hour, Martha cleaned Elizabeth's wounds and the deep rope burns on her wrists and the cut on her stomach. That thankfully wasn't as bad as all the blood had made it look, and the various bruises and scrapes. Thomas stayed nearby and heating water, and fetching supplies, and trying not to think too hard about what kind of men would do this to a young woman, and leave her to die. When Martha finally came out of the spare room, and her sleeves rolled up, and her face tired, and she found Thomas in the kitchen. "She'll be all right," Martha said, "and physically anyway, and nothing's broken and the wounds will heal." "And otherwise?" Thomas asked. Martha sighed, and "That'll take longer, and she's been through something terrible, Thomas, and really terrible." "She say what happened?" "Not yet," Martha said, and And maybe not for a while, but we'll give her time and she can stay here as long as she needs." Thomas nodded, and grateful as always for his wife's good heart, Elizabeth stayed in that spare room for 3 days and barely speaking and eating, only when Martha coaxed her and sleeping fitfully and sometimes crying out in the night. On the 4th day she came out to the kitchen and moving slow, and one hand pressed against her ribs, and Martha was making breakfast and the smell of bacon and eggs filling the house. "Sit down," Martha said gently. "And you shouldn't be on your feet yet." "I've been lying down too long," Elizabeth said. But she sat anyway, and at the worn wooden table where Thomas and Martha had shared thousands of meals over their 30 years of marriage. Thomas came in from the barn, and the morning feeding done, and stopped when he saw Elizabeth mourning, he said, and taking off his hat, and, "Good too. See you up." She offered a small smile, and the first one he'd seen, and, "Morning, Mr. Brennan, and thank you again, and both of you and I don't know how to repay such kindness." "No repayment needed," Thomas said, and sitting down across from her, "and anyone would have done the same." "No," Elizabeth said quietly, and no, they wouldn't have. Over breakfast, and Elizabeth ate more than she had in days, and she began to talk. She'd been traveling through Texas with a man she thought loved her, and a gambler named Johnny Reeves, and he'd promised her the world and promised they'd go to California and start fresh, but Johnny had debts and bad ones and to bad men, and when those men caught up with them outside of San Antonio, and they'd decided to send Johnny a message. "They beat me," Elizabeth said, and her voice steady but her hands shaking around her coffee cup, "and beat me, and told Johnny this was his warning, and then Johnny, and he just left." She looked up, then, and tears in her eyes, and he rode away while they tied me to that tree, and he didn't even look back. Martha reached across the table and took Elizabeth's hand. "Some men aren't worth the ground they walk on," Martha said, "but you're here now, and you're alive, and that's what matters." "I don't have anywhere to go," Elizabeth admitted, "and no family and no money and nothing." Thomas and Martha exchanged a look, and the kind of look that comes from 3 decades of marriage and knowing what the other is thinking without words. "You can stay here," Thomas said, "and long as you need, and we could use help around the ranch anyway, and Martha's been after me to hire someone for the house and the garden." Elizabeth looked between them, and disbelief written on her face, and, "You'd do that, and for a stranger?" "You're not a stranger anymore," Martha said simply. "And you're Elizabeth, and you need help, and we can provide it, and that's what people do." So Elizabeth stayed at first. She was quiet and jumpy at sudden noises and flinching when Thomas moved too quickly but slowly, and day by day, and she began to heal. She helped Martha in the garden, and learning which plants needed more water, and which needed pruning, and finding. She had a knack for coaxing things to grow. She learned to cook Martha's cornbread, and the recipe that had been passed down through 3 generations, and she fed the chickens and collected eggs and mended clothes on the porch in the evenings. Thomas taught her to ride properly and not side saddle like she'd learned as a girl, but really ride, and he showed her the boundaries of the ranch and pointed out landmarks and told her stories about the land. "This cottonwood here," he said one day, and stopping near a different tree than the one where he'd found her, "and this is where I proposed to Martha, and 40 years ago come spring." 40 years, Elizabeth said, and wonder in her voice, and that's a lifetime. "It is," Thomas agreed, and the best lifetime I could have asked for. "How did you know," Elizabeth asked, "and that she was the right one?" Thomas was quiet for a moment and watching the clouds drift across the sky, "I guess," he said finally. "And I knew because being with her felt like coming home, and every single time, and even now, and even after 40 years, Elizabeth nodded slowly, "and I thought Johnny was home, but I was wrong." "Being wrong about someone doesn't make you foolish," Thomas said, "and it makes you human, and we all want to believe in people and want to trust, and that's not a weakness, Elizabeth, and that's what makes us decent." Summer turned to fall, and the prairie grass going golden, and the mornings getting crisp, and Elizabeth had been with them almost 4 months. She'd filled out some, and the good food and steady work giving her color, and her wounds had healed into scars, and the visible ones anyway, And she smiled more often and even laughed sometimes at Thomas's terrible jokes. One evening, Martha and Elizabeth were in the kitchen and preserving tomatoes, and when Elizabeth suddenly spoke, "I want to stay," she said, "and not just for a while, but, and really stay, and if you'll have me, Martha L."